Hello. This lecture is going to talk about the second half of Chapter 3, Section 5, starting with the fall of the Qin Dynasty and the rise of the Han Dynasty. So Shi Huangdi died in 210 BC, and because his rule had been so cruel and so difficult for people to bear, there was a lot of backlash from in the wake of his death. The taxes, the forced labor, all the cruel policies of legalism all came back to bite the Qin dynasty in the butt, as it were. And so the dynasty fell apart basically after Xin Huangdi died. When he died, there was only about 4 more years left in the dynasty before a peasant revolt basically took over, led by this guy named Gao Zu. Gao Zu successfully defeated all of the other rival lords of China at the time, reunified China together in pretty much the exact same way that Shi Huangdi had done originally. But Gao went on to form his own dynasty called the Han Dynasty, named after the original area that he was in charge of, in control of. Gao tried to bring stability back to China in the wake of this sort of infighting, but he didn't do it in the cruel ways that Shi Huangdi had done. He actually eased off on the taxes and got rid of a lot of the policies of the legalism system. He brought Confucian ideas back, Confucian scholars and ideas that had been outlawed or demonized in the role of the Qin dynasty. So the Han dynasty, and specifically Gao, was instrumental in bringing back a sense of stability to China. Here you can see the borders of the Han dynasty. And here you can see the most famous of the Han emperors. So Gao may have been the founder, but the most famous Han emperor is this guy, the Emperor Wu Di. He, like all of these other scholars or all these other emperors who kind of understood what was needed in China, brought Confucianism back in a big way. And tried to design his government around Confucian ideals. And we'll see how he did that in a second. He even went so far as to establish a university, an imperial university in Xi'an, where people could learn about Confucian ideas. The other thing Wu Di is famous for, in addition to basic, stuff to improve the economy of his empire, was the fact that he maintained a monopoly on iron and salt in his dynasty. A monopoly is generally a bad thing. A monopoly where one organization or one person controls every aspect of a particular industry. It's generally a bad thing because it means that without competition, you can basically charge whatever you want for something. If only one person can give you guys iron and the stuff to make iron and use iron for tools, then he can charge whatever he wants for iron, which isn't really good for being fair, but which is great for if you are an emperor trying to fund an empire. So Wu Di's monopoly was exploitative, but it did allow him to help keep his empire afloat economically. The other thing famous that happened in Wu Di's Han dynasty is that he adopted an official policy of expansionism. Expansionism is when a country formally decides that it's going to actively pursue expanding the amount of territory that it controls. Usually this happens through warfare. And Wu Di did this. He pushed his territory's borders up north past the Great Wall into the area that was controlled by nomads, but also south into Korea, Tibet, Central Asia, all these places. This is sort of a two-edged sword. Obviously, if most of this expansion is happening through war, then there's a lot of unnecessary death and all these things. But what this also does is it creates a lot of opportunities for cultural diffusion, because as we know, one of the big ways that cultural diffusion occurs is through warfare, because as China starts to move into non-Chinese territories, those territories start to share their ideas with China, and Chinese ideas start to move their way into non-Chinese territories. So cultural diffusion happens here as China expands under the Han Dynasty. But we should remember that that carries with it some positives and negatives. Negatives because of the warfare, positives because of the cultural diffusion. The Silk Road was also a big part of what was going on in the Han Dynasty during the time of Wu Di. We've already talked about the Silk Road extensively back in Chapter 3, Section 4. So if you want to revisit that topic, you can take a look at what we said there. But here you can see a map of the different trade networks, as well as some of the facts that pertain to the Silk Road. The other big thing that we see in the Han Dynasty is the implementation of a civil service system in China. A civil servant is just a fancy name for a government official or a government worker. What made this system interesting or special, and something that we haven't really seen a lot of yet before, is the fact that in order to be a part of this government system, in order to be a civil servant and to work in the government of China, you actually had to be good at your job. You applied to become a government worker, a civil servant, not just because you happen to know somebody or are related to the previous person who was in government or a kid of the king, but you had to prove that you actually knew what you were doing. And just like most jobs that we think of today, you had to apply and start at the bottom. And as you did good at your bottom level job, you worked your way up until eventually you moved your way through the political ladder, getting better and better jobs, higher and higher ranking positions. This is the first time, as far as we've seen in our class, where government functions the way that we expect it to function today. That is, it functions almost like a business, right? You have to prove you're good at your job so you can get a promotion, and so on and so forth. And then you may ask, how was this organized? What was the point of it all? How did you prove you were good at what you did? Well, it all had to do with Confucius. Because remember, Wu Di famously, and the Han Dynasty in general, tried to bring Confucian ideas back into being the core of the government. And so in order to get into the government, you had to know Confucius. And specifically, you had to know the 5 classics, which was a collection of histories and poems and handbooks that had been compiled by Confucius himself. And the thought was, if you study your Confucian scholarship, you study the 5 classics, and you really know your stuff, you can take a test. You can take a civil service exam. And if you pass that exam through rigorous study, you can then become a member of the government. And if you could do this, it was a great thing, especially if your family came from like a poor family or a family that didn't have anybody else who was already in the government. Getting this job by passing these tests would have been a really big boost to you, economically, socially, all that stuff. There were some flaws in this, though. Obviously, to pass these exams, you have to study. And not everybody has the leisure time and the freedom to just sit around and study these things for several years, right? If your family is a bunch of poor farmers, right, you're really not going to have time to sit around studying the 5 classics to pass this test. But if you were rich and wealthy and noble, it was a lot easier for you to have that spare time and maybe tutors and all that stuff to give you that significant boost. The other problem we see is that women were not allowed to take these exams. And we're not surprised. Confucius himself did not believe that there was an equal level between women and men. We remember in the 5 relationships that Confucius has, husband to wife is not one of the equal relationships. It's a hierarchical relationship with men in a dominant position. So no women were allowed to take these tests, which means that no woman is allowed to get a job in government, which means a significant shrinking of power for women at this time in Chinese culture. So not a great system, not a perfect system, but a much better system from our perspective compared to what we've seen in other places, because theoretically, people could get jobs in government even if they were not related to nobility. They weren't inheriting these jobs. Interestingly, this civil service system stuck around all the way until 1912. So if you're wondering, Dr. Scanlon keeps talking about how Confucian ideas are still at the heart of a lot of what goes on in the Chinese mind or in the Chinese government. It's because all the way up until 1912 AD, Confucius's civil service system based on Confucian teachings was the norm. So it's not surprising to see that China's government kind of can't escape from Confucius. The Han Dynasty is also known as the Golden Age of China, not the Classical Age, but the Golden Age of China. And we know what a Golden Age is from what we talked about in our India chapter. Like all Golden Ages, or like all big cultural output eras, we see some really great advances in astronomy and physics and medicine. Acupuncture is probably the most interesting one that we see in our textbook, a very unique medical technology that comes from the Chinese world. This is also the era when the Han people figured out how to make paper in the way that we make paper today with wood pulp. Okay? I always like to talk about women in this era. And the best that we can find as far as summarizing what life was like for women in this era comes from a text called Lessons for Women by Ban Zhao. And Ban Zhao basically says that women, girls, should be educated equally to men, which sounds awesome, which sounds great, sounds very different from what we would expect in a lot of ancient societies. However, he also says that despite that education, women should still be obedient, respectful, and submissive to their male counterparts. So, no surprises here as far as where women stand in this society. But it's nice to see women being allowed to be educated and being encouraged to be educated, because even though they don't necessarily get any other power in their culture because of that, it still shows that we're putting more effort into treating women with a certain amount of equal respect. This is also a time in China where Buddhism really took off. Originally, Buddhism was not very popular in China because it seemed to focus on individuals rather than on families. Individual salvation versus family salvation. And we know how important family was in the Chinese world. Think about things like filial piety, as we discussed in section 4. But because Buddhism offered answers to problems that we did not see in Taoism or in Confucian thought, Buddhism starts to take off as a means of helping people escape from the suffering in their lives in a way that we don't see through Taoism and Confucius. And eventually, all of these things blended together, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, to create a unique form of Buddhism that really could be popular in China at this time. The Han Dynasty doesn't stick around forever, though. A combination of internal and external pressures takes them down. So you have some internal intrigue where people are backstabbing each other, literally and figuratively, to get bigger places in the government. These weakened rulers who are too busy on protecting themselves can't fight back against external forces like these military rulers, these warlords from other places in China. As they're focused on themselves and they don't focus on their empire, the infrastructure of the empire starts to fall apart. And after a peasant revolt where they were fighting back against things like the heavy taxation and debt that they were dealing with, eventually warlords took out the last Han emperor, ending about 400 years of unity in China and chopping it up into a bunch of little kingdoms again. This is the second time that we've seen so far where China has been unified and then broken apart, but then it gets put back together again by a new dynasty, the Sui dynasty, who, focusing on Confucius, just like the Han dynasty did, brings China back together once more. But this idea of this repeating cycle of China is brought together, broken apart, brought together, broken apart, very fitting in light of what we talked about before, this idea of the dynastic cycle. China's history seems to be this repeating cycle. And the pattern is one that we've seen already. Come together, broken apart. Come together, broken apart. That takes us to the end of our China chapter. After this, we'll be talking about Greece. But until then, I'll see you next time.